Chalcroft Farm is probably the oldest farmstead on the One Horton Heath site. It was originally called Calfcroft or Calf's Paddock, but based on the way it was spelt, it seems to have changed over the years to become Chalcroft Farm. Chalcroft Farm is a quintessential Hampshire farmstead with a collection of buildings that have grown and changed over the years as the farm has adapted to the changing circumstances. A series of surveys undertaken since 2018, along with drone footage in 2020, showed that the buildings had fallen into severe disrepair following long periods of disuse and lack of maintenance. At the same time though, these surveys gave us a really good understanding of the overall condition of the farm, as well as the usage and the changes to some of the specific buildings. We also managed to identify a number of materials and structures within the existing buildings that were capable of being salvaged and potentially reused within our proposed developments. Throughout 2021, we've been undertaking a careful programme of dismantling some of the existing buildings. Given the size of the sites, along with ecological constraints and the need to pick the buildings apart carefully so as to preserve some of the best materials, we've been undertaking the work in 3 phases. A specialist team from our supply chain have now completed the first phase of dismantling works. We've been recording and then collecting and storing individual materials and components from the buildings as we take them down. Bricks, particularly old bricks and brickwork, and some of the large oak timber beams and joints where there are good examples that we can take from the barn structure. The large barn was probably built in around 1750. It's a large oak-framed barn with a thatched roof, with a brick surround or a low-level wall all around the perimeter of the barn. Another part of the barn was added on approximately 100 years later, so in the mid-1800s, an oak-framed thatched barn but with no brickwork this time around. We understand that the barn actually collapsed in around 1947 and was stood back up again with the original timbers, but with the brickwork then replaced. So a lot of the barn that we saw when we arrived on site had very modern brickwork, it had an asbestos roof, and unfortunately most of the timbers were too damaged to be salvageable. Here we've got a collection of bricks that have been salvaged from the large barn. These bricks would have been part of the original barn, so probably dating back to around 1750 or perhaps even earlier. And you can see that the shape and the size of the brick is quite distinctively different from the modern bricks that we build with these days. And that is quite typical of the time and the type of bricks that would have been used, and also of Hampshire barns specifically for this type of brickwork to be used in this type of barn. So if I compare it to an imperial brick, you can see that the brick is much shorter and also thinner. The imperial bricks were standardised in about the mid-1800s. So then we started to see these larger bricks, and they went through all the way to about 1970 when the modern brickworks were introduced using the metric system, which are ever so slightly smaller. And it's just a useful way of quickly getting a guide to the rough age of buildings and when they might have been stood. If it's one of these, then almost certainly it had to be before 1850. If it's an imperial brick, then probably between about 1850 and 1970. And the modern brickwork is fairly obvious. Here we've got an example of one of the oak beams that we've been able to salvage from the large barn. You can see that there's some really good examples of the joints underneath, the pegs that were used to hold those joints together, and just some really nice timber work that can be reused in existing buildings as part of the aesthetic and to make it more attractive inside. Once we've completed all of the phases of demolition, we'll also be undertaking a programme of archaeological work to look at what might still be concealed below the ground here. The trouble with the site is that it's been heavily developed over the years, so the ground has been very disturbed. If we look around, there's a lot of tarmac and hard standing. But also with a site of this nature, there's lots of potential to find things because people have lived here for so many centuries. Some of the things that we might look for specifically include an original manor house that stood behind where the farmhouse stands at the moment, and just generally investigating some of the areas around the existing buildings to see what else we can find and tell ourselves about the site. What made Chalcroft Farm interesting is the overall collection of buildings and how they relate to one another, which helps understand how the farm was used as a whole and how it's evolved over several centuries. So there's no particular building that you can look at and go, this is a fantastic example of a heritage building. But at the same time, the farm as a whole has played an important part in the history of the local area. The proposal is that as we design and build new buildings on this part of the site, they will be able to incorporate some of the original materials that we've taken from the old farm buildings that originally stood here at one point. And by reusing those materials within the new buildings at 1 Horton Heath, it's making sure that we continue to recognise the heritage of Chalcroft Farm and the part that it's played in the local community.